Hello and welcome. I'm Thomas Porteous and you are watching the World Report on NewsX World. Let's take a look at the top headlines of the hour. Russia has launched drones and missiles targeting power substations supplying 2 nuclear plants in Ukraine, killing 7 people. Kiev accuses Moscow of endangering Europe's nuclear safety as thousands lose power after widespread damage. Turkey's foreign defence and intelligence chiefs will travel to Pakistan this week to discuss ceasefire talks with Afghanistan. President Erdogan has stated the trip seeks to broker a permanent peace deal between the neighbouring nations. The US Treasury says it seeks to use a moment in Lebanon to halt Iranian funding and press Hezbollah to disarm. Officials say Tehran has funneled around $1 billion to the group this year despite heavy Western sanctions. At least 2 people die in the Philippines as super typhoon Fong lashed the central and eastern parts of the country. Meanwhile, officials say nearly 1.2 million people have been moved to safety ahead of the storm's full landfall. Hundreds are missing after a boat carrying around 300 people from Myanmar sank near the Thailand-Malaysia border. Authorities say 10 survivors and 1 body have been found as search operations continue for more victims at sea. Saudi Arabia has executed 2 men for joining a terrorist group that planned attacks on places of worship and security sites. The Interior Ministry says the executions followed investigations that uncovered their involvement in the plots. Syrian President Ahmed al-Shara has arrived in Washington for talks with President Trump, days after the US lifted sanctions against him. Discussions will focus on joint efforts against Islamic State after Syria arrested dozens of suspected militants. And Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov says he is ready to meet US Secretary of State Marco Rubio, but insists Moscow's interests must be respected. The Kremlin also denies reports that Lavrov has fallen out of favor with President Putin. We start this hour in West Asia, and Hamas's armed wing has stated that fighters held up in the Israeli-held Rafah area of Gaza will not surrender to Israel. Hamas has urged mediators to find a solution to a crisis that threatens the month-old ceasefire. Sources close to mediation efforts told Reuters news agency on Thursday that fighters could surrender their arms in exchange for passage to other areas of the enclave under a proposal aimed at resolving the stalemate. Now, Egyptian mediators have proposed that, in exchange for safe passage, fighters still in Rafah surrender their arms to Egypt and give details of tunnels so they can be destroyed. This is said by one of the sources, an Egyptian security official. Now, the latest statement from the Al-Qassam brigades, an armed wing of Hamas, held Israel responsible for engaging the fighters, while Israel has said that their forces were defending themselves. Now, joining us for this discussion is Jordan Cope. He is a Middle East expert who joins us live from Dallas, Texas. Jordan, thank you very much for joining us. Hamas says its remaining fighters in Rafah won't surrender, while Israel maintains troops are acting in self-defense. Of course, the United Nations has said that 1.9 million Gazans and roughly 85% of the enclave's population have been displaced. Is this more displacement, Jordan?
This is simply Israel retaining its positions in a very dangerous part of the Gaza Strip. Since the ceasefire has commenced, 3 Israeli soldiers have been attacked and killed, attacked unilaterally, I must add, by Hamas, in the process violating key provisions of the ceasefire agreement and killing Israeli soldiers. Israeli soldiers, like any other nation, shouldn't be expected to be sitting ducks on the front lines while trying to preserve a ceasefire agreement, no less trying to make sure that a terrorist group doesn't take advantage of that ceasefire agreement, as they have done time and time again. The simple conditions that are being proposed by Egypt as a mediator are very simple, simply that Hamas disarm and that these 200 fighters located in Rafah help Israel identify and locate tunnels so they can be destroyed. One of the most key foremost provisions of the current pending ceasefire agreement in place right now is that Hamas ultimately disarm. And if Hamas ultimately cannot disarm from Rafah, surrender their weapons for their own survival, what good is the rest of the ceasefire deal?
But Jordan, Egyptian mediators proposed safe passage if fighters hand over weapons and, of course, reveal the tunnel maps underneath the enclave. Given that both Qatar and Egypt, both former mediators trusted by Israel, have backed this plan, why hasn't Israel signalled support?
I wouldn't say they're fully trusted by Israel. Qatar has given Hamas approximately $2 billion since 2012. The reality of geopolitics is that these are the countries that potentially could forge some sort of agreement. Israel certainly has a right to be skeptical because its own national security is at stake, and tunnels have been found under complexes built by Qatar in the Gaza Strip. So Israel has every right to remain skeptical regarding Qatar's ultimate motives when it comes to the Gaza Strip, because Qatar refuses to recognize Israel, it refuses to have diplomatic relations with Israel, and at the end of the day, Qatar as a mediator is one that cannot be trusted fully.
And Jordan, in this latest statement from the Al-Qassam brigades, it says Israel is responsible for engaging the fighters, and Israel, of course, have stated that they were merely defending themselves in this situation. Your thoughts on this combat of information, of course, that is all too common during this conflict?
Hamas's statements, especially that of the Al-Qassam brigades, which is its military wing, should never be taken at face value. Just about everything Hamas has espoused throughout the war, statements have been full of misinformation. And Israel has had to pay the price most recently, as I mentioned earlier. 3 Israeli soldiers were killed, literally just trying to enforce the ceasefire agreement, not entertaining violence, maintaining the peace. Ultimately, they paid the price with their own lives. So Al-Qassam's statement that Israel is simply engaging these Hamas fighters simply couldn't be further from the truth. I think the number one question we need to ask at the end of the day is, when media kept on claiming that there is such a famine crisis in Gaza and Hamas blamed Israel, these Hamas fighters have now been stuck in tunnels for approximately 6 days. One has to question how they were able to manage to store so much food down in those tunnels and continue to, quote unquote, resist. And in light of Hamas's statement that these fighters will not surrender, one has to question whether Hamas's motives are ultimately suicidal for all.
Now, of course, a broader question next, Jordan. You, of course, mentioned that there's been deaths of 3 Israeli soldiers since October the 10th. Of course, over 200 people have been killed in Gaza since that ceasefire was announced earlier on this month. Your overall analysis of the fragility of the current ceasefire deal and the likeliness of it moving on to the second phase?
It definitely remains to be seen. The United States is ultimately one of the strongest actors, and the United States seems to want to preserve the ceasefire agreement. Hamas ultimately killing Israeli soldiers escalated conflict within the Gaza Strip and resulted in ultimately some airstrikes that ensued. Also important to note that one of the key militant groups in the Gaza Strip, a terrorist org, the Islamic Jihad, is not a party to the agreement. So this agreement is not binding upon them and how Israel responds to them. However, all of this being said, Hamas has definitely toyed with the ceasefire agreement. It has returned bodies of deceased hostages late. It has returned remains of those not supposedly belonging to the hostages identified. And of course, on top of that, it has blatantly attacked Israeli troops, violating the most key provisions while also not disarming. Hamas has materially violated key conditions of the ceasefire agreement. It has made clear that it has no intent to disarm. And ultimately, if Hamas refuses to disarm, however the United States might try to preserve the ceasefire agreement, it might be very fragile. And we might also see tensions escalate in Lebanon, where the Lebanese government has ultimately failed to disarm Hezbollah.
Yeah, we will talk about that in just a second, Jordan. But we move on to our next story, and we move from the Palestinian territory and over to Israel. And as the dispute over jurisdiction on the Sde Teiman hostage abuse video probe escalates, the High Court of Justice has now issued interim injunctions to all authorities to file responses by today at 8 p.m. A hearing on the petitions is scheduled for Tuesday before High Court Justices Yael Wilner, Alex Steen and Gila Carney-Steinitz. The order was issued in order to expedite the judicial process due to the highly sensitive nature of the situation and the tension between different government agencies and figures who are in parallel claiming authority over investigation. Now let's move over to Lebanon, where its local media claims a Lebanese civilian was killed in a targeted Israeli drone strike on Sunday morning, which hit a vehicle on the Al-Sawanna-Khirbet Selm road in southern Lebanon. The attack, confirmed by the Lebanese Ministry of Public Health, took place in the Bint Jubail area, a region that has seen rising tensions in recent weeks. The drone strike follows an escalation of Israeli military activity in the south of Lebanon, with reports of Israeli drones firing missiles and flying at low altitudes over several towns, including Tyre, Nexperia and Bint Jubail. This latest attack adds to the growing number of Israeli air and artillery strikes in the region, and the situation in southern Lebanon remains very tense, with frequent drone overflights and military movements increasing the risk of further escalation. Now, of course, Jordan joins us once again. Israel says its strike in southern Lebanon is targeting Hezbollah operatives. What more can you tell us about these alleged Hezbollah sites operating in the Lebanese south, Jordan?
One must not forget, before this recent war with Hezbollah ensued, Hezbollah had a rocket stockpile of approximately 150,000 rockets, many of them, at least dozens of them, precision guided, that could have really caused severe devastation to Israel. Hezbollah for long was considered the greatest threat on Israel's borders before October 7th. And after Israel's beeper and pager operations that took out many Hezbollah officials and ensuing airstrikes, given that Hezbollah ultimately decided to attack Israel in and around October 7th, Israel ultimately was pulled into a war in Lebanon that had been mounting in terms of tensions for years. And so one of the key provisions of the ceasefire agreement, a 60-day ceasefire agreement in 2024, was that Hezbollah would retreat northwards of the Litani River, ensuring that it couldn't attack Israel so proximately on Israel's border. And so what we're seeing now, unfortunately, is that the Lebanese government has struggled to disarm Hezbollah as it would have pleased. The United States has made very clear of Lebanon's responsibility to disarm Hezbollah and for Hezbollah to disarm as soon and as quickly as possible. Hezbollah's failure has increasingly drawn concern from the United States, and it also has drawn concern even from members of Lebanese parliament. For instance, Charles Jabbour of the Lebanese Forces Party has made clear that Hezbollah could be drawing Israel into war into Lebanon, and that Israel has a right to respond to Hezbollah. Hezbollah's ultimate goal is to advance Iran's agenda on Israel's borders, to advance a Shiite Islamist vision, and to destroy Israel. And so it's becoming increasingly clear that as Hezbollah continues to reinforce and reinstall its infrastructure in southern Lebanon, war could be on the horizon.
I was going to say, you called it a war just then at the start of your statements. What does that say about the current fragility of course, there was a ceasefire signed last November. However, Israel has continued to conduct strikes, of course, mainly in Lebanon. Your thoughts on how this may escalate, may move forward? And of course, you spoke there briefly about the pager operation that, of course, was undertaken by Israel, the successiveness of that, and the challenges of tackling, of course, the idea of Hezbollah in Lebanon with a fragile government as it is?
Going back to your comment regarding war, indeed the ceasefire agreement was a 60-day one, and it has since expired. Something interesting on the horizon to observe in terms of understanding how the situation will be contained could be the United States meeting with Ahmed Ashara, the president of Syria, in the US next month. Of course, from Iran to get to Lebanon, where Hezbollah, Iran's proxy, operates, one has to go through Iraq and Syria towards Lebanon. The United States has made clear that right now it's time to stop Hezbollah's funding. And the United States has proposed in Syria a key buttress against Lebanon, where Hezbollah operates, to put a base actually in Damascus to demilitarize Syria's south. And the implications could be very interesting, at least in terms of the United States proposal to put a base in Damascus. It shows that the United States is increasingly more concerned about containing the Iranian threat for years to come, to contain Iranian supplies and reinforcements from going to Lebanon, which could help Hezbollah in the future. So we're seeing increasingly more interest from the United States in trying to prevent future war, but also in trying to suppress Hezbollah at the same time.
Okay, Jordan Cope, thank you very much for joining us. It's a pleasure to have you on the programme. We now move over and east, where in a significant move, China has implemented measures to exempt the export of Nexperia chips that comply with civilian use. According to the Chinese Commerce Ministry, the country is closely monitoring the ongoing dispute with the Netherlands over Nexperia, which has caused a shortage of chips and posed a threat to car production. The ministry's statement emphasised that China is awaiting concrete actions from the Dutch side to resolve the issue. Now, additionally, the statement welcomed Europe's continued efforts to urge the Netherlands to address what it called wrongful practices. The ongoing chip shortage continues to impact industries worldwide. We're now joined by Dr. Asta Chadha. She is at Ritsumeikan University and is an associate professor of international relations. She's joining us live from Kyoto in Japan. Thank you very much for joining us. Tell us a little bit more about this dispute. It's been developing now for over a week. China has now announced these exemptions for Nexperia chip exports to meet civilian use standards. What does that mean?
Having me here to discuss this very important issue. Well, I mean, the story goes back to September 2025 when, the Dutch had invoked a very Cold War era law to seize control over Nexperia. And when I say seize control, they basically labeled it as an entity of concern because it had Chinese directors. And the main company, the holding company, is also Wingtech, which is a Chinese company. And most of the chips that Nexperia used to produce, they were first sent to China, and then from there they were sent to rest of the world, which includes mainly the automakers in the US and Europe. And so the Dutch had cited that this is a national security concern for them, and they had basically stopped any of these exports to China in the first place. And then China retaliated by seizing its own exports of the processed Nexperia chips. And basically it in some way, I mean, it majorly, I would say, impacted the automakers that were largely based in the US and in Europe. And I'm talking about the big ones, Volkswagen, Volvo cars. And of course, they retaliated because this would have led to a complete shutdown of their businesses and of their factories. So when, very recently when President Trump met with Chinese Premier Xi Jinping, there was supposedly a deal that was struck. And even though both the statements from both the sides did not really explicitly state that it was a discussion on chips, but that is what is being anticipated. And the idea was that China would loosen its grip or would loosen somehow the export control that it had implemented. And the implication would be that the chips would now be exported to Europe and to American automakers so that they can resume the production that they wanted to do, and it wouldn't harm the global supply chains.
Yes, and Dr. Chadha, the Netherlands has restricted these advanced chip exports, citing national security concerns under US pressure. Is China's exemption policy a strategic olive branch or a calculated move to isolate European partners from Washington?
Yeah, I mean, very rightly said. I mean, on one hand, we could look at it as a Chinese well-calculated move in some way to rather than strengthening its clutches, actually to ensure free trade, to ensure free movement of these very valuable chips. I mean, though they don't really have too much of a military implication, but there is an economic implication when we're talking about these chips that are important to the automakers. And on the other hand, if we look at it from a Chinese strategy perspective, pretty much the Chinese threw the ball in the Dutch court and said that this is we are easing the export controls at our end, and now it's up to the Europeans to do the same and to loosen their grip on the Chinese entities.
Yeah, and finally, what does this mean for Europe's tech independence? Trying to balance US alignment on export controls, but of course it has this huge reliance on Chinese manufacturing. What more can you tell us, Dr. Chadha?
Yeah, I mean, see, if you look at it very realistically, I mean, the Dutch government has not yet relinquished control of Nexperia. That's one. Clearly, the implication for China is that they are not willing to resume because, earlier they let out a statement. These automakers had to come up with a statement that said that we will no longer be sending 70% of our chips to China. So the implication is that they're trying to find an alternative. But I mean, is the alternative ready? So the implication for the European automakers, or at least for the European governments, would be then to come up with a very comprehensive strategy as to if they want to lay out the plans for an alternative supply chain. It needs to happen fast because as of now, China remains very, very critical to the supply chain.
Yeah, and of course this underscores a deeper question. Where is the line between economic protectionism and legitimate security regulation in today's sort of chip wars?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this incident is just one of the many, right? I mean, actually, even though I mentioned the events from September 2025, if you look it up, it goes way back to December 2024 when the US first came out with this entities of concerns list, and WingTech was on it. WingTech is the holding company for Nexperia. So it had begun right then, on probably a bit earlier than that as well. So we are looking at an increase in the number of cases. This is just one of those, that highlight how vulnerable our global supply chains are. And we are not just talking about military products. We are talking about our day-to-day use electronics. And in some way, it also highlights how difficult it is to practically de-risk from China. I mean, most countries do want to in some way diversify their supply chains, but when it comes to practicality, we do not have an alternative ready and to go. So, I mean, in a way, it is highlighting that these chip wars are nowhere. I mean, we are not seeing a sign of them ceasing. This is going to continue. There might not be a military implication to this, but just the fact that they are very, very crucial to the supply chains, this is going to remain one of those avenues for economic warfare.
Yes, Dr. Sde Chadha, thank you very much for joining us here on NewsX World. It's a pleasure to have you on the programme. Now we move on, and at least 2 people have died in the Philippines as super typhoon Feng Wong lashed central and eastern parts of the country. A 64-year-old woman was pulled from debris after returning to her house while fleeing with family members. Authorities report that more than 1 million people have been preemptively evacuated ahead of the storm's expected landfall in the northern Luzon region. Feng Wong, locally known as Uwan, is battering Luzon with sustained winds of up to 185 kilometers per hour and gusts up to 230. The storm has led to widespread evacuations and suspensions of work and classes, particularly in Metro Manila. Signal number 5 alerts have been issued for the most vulnerable areas, and authorities urge residents to comply with evacuation orders. The military has redeployed 2,000 troops for disaster response. Of course, here on NewsX World, we will continue to bring you all the updates coming out of the Philippines as that typhoon rages on. Well, that's all that we have time for this hour. Keep watching NewsX World for more international news updates.